Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Sell. He is assistant professor of psychology and criminology at Heidelberg University. He is an evolutionary psychologist interested in anger and aggression, hatred and formidability, estimation, and we're going to talk about a little bit of all of that today. So, Dr. Sell, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So let's start perhaps with a little bit of background, let's say, before we get really into anger, hatred, and other emotions. What would you say is the best framework for understanding emotions from an evolutionary perspective?
That's a good question. I think and there are really two ways of using evolutionary theory to understand an organism. There's the phylogenetic approach, which is what you usually hear about, right? It's the, we came from apes or something like that, and therefore this other animal does a thing, and that's probably why we do it. We've inherited that from them. That's useful. I don't cast, to disparage those approaches, but they have limitations, and their big limitations are they can't account for unique features of any organism, because if it's unique, you can't trace it to your ancestor, right? So how do you account for the elephant trunk if it's recent, its only living ancestors don't have it, right? And it also doesn't explain things particularly functionally, which is what you need, I think, to understand complex organisms or complex organs and mental adaptations. So the other approach other than phylogenetic is the adaptationist approach, which says that natural selection builds complex functional machinery. That's what life is. And by using that and identifying the function of any particular organ or adaptation, you can explain its features really well. And so that's the approach I use, particularly with anger, which is, what is its function? Why is it? Anger has, a lot of problems to it. It causes, relationships to break down. It causes aggression, gets you killed sometimes. And so why is it, our ancestors who didn't have anger didn't reproduce better? Why didn't we descend from the non-angry people? We all descended from people who had something like modern anger. And so it was doing something to help our reproduction. And once we identified that, it explains the features of anger and why it works the way it does.
I was going to ask you what social emotions are, but does it make sense to talk about social and non-social emotions?
Well, I think we could divide the world that way if we want to. So emotions from an evolutionary psychological perspective are kind of emergency systems that sort of come online to deal with some recurrent adaptive problem. And they sort of usurp a lot of different features of the mind and the body, right? So the autonomic nervous system responds, your face, your voice, your attention systems, your perceptual systems change under different emotions. And some of these emotions are built, I think, to deal with social negotiation, so anger, or to deal with social problems, hatred being an example, shame, guilt, and so forth. There are other emotions, things like fear or anxiety that may be social but may not be. You can be afraid of heights, you can be afraid of fire, you can be afraid of animals. So if people want to make that distinction, they can. I sort of think the most important distinction is to group them by function. Right, what is the function of this particular emotion, then study that to some extent separately from the other emotions.
With that in mind, then, what are the functions of anger? And what is anger, generally speaking?
That's great. The most highly edited sentence in any paper I ever wrote was one of my first papers where I introduced my theory of anger. It's called the recalibrational theory. And we defined anger as, we said that a large and well-bounded set of the phenomenon people refer to as anger can be explained as an adaptation to bargain for better treatment. And we put it that way because if you say the word anger, it can mean lots of different things. It's like the word love. I love ketchup and I love orange soda and my children and my wife, but all in very different ways. And there is a core commonality. There's a reason we're using the word love for that. It's something of high value. Understood that way, anger is a very complicated mechanism in the mind. Most of what it does can be explained as an adaptation that bargains for better treatment, that the function of it is to get other human beings' brains to recalibrate and treat you better. Colloquially, it would be to treat you with more respect. There are other kind of subroutines, things we sometimes refer to as anger that don't fit that pattern. So you get frustrated because, like, I don't know, a piece, you're trying to fix a clock and the thing won't fit into the thing and you get frustrated and you jam it and break it, that sort of, or you're trying to climb a tree and you can't, and so you get frustrated and just grab it and rip your arm. That actually happened to me in grad school. And so I get those things aren't you recalibrating the clock's mind or anything like that. So there are, at the fringes, what you see are that it's a very complex system that is made from parts, and some of those parts are fired by alternative systems. So there might be some other system like a frustration system or something like that, or determination, where one of the features of anger is that it prepares you to pay costs to get that long-term benefit of recalibrating a person. And sometimes, so when you get angry at people, you should expect there are going to be some short-term costs to that. And it was selected for because of the long-term benefits that follow if you actually succeed in getting that person to treat you better over the long term. And so that the sort of acceptance of costs feels kind of like determination, right? And there may be other systems that fire that as well, and you might call that anger. So at the fringes, it gets very complex because the human mind is insanely complex. The brain is more complex than any computer we've ever designed. And so that can complicate things, but the core of it, most of the features of anger, if you reverse engineer it, if you find out what anger looks like and try to explain it to a Martian, you just start listing off features that are really well designed for bargaining for better treatment, right? It turns on when somebody treats you with disrespect or imposes costs on you or indicates that you're not worthy of value. You then get that person's attention and you feed them arguments and threats of anger or threats of aggression or the withdrawal of cooperation. You puff up, you make your face and your body look tougher and so forth. You challenge them, you refuse to cooperate with them until they change their mind, you bring it to their attention. And when they apologize and recalibrate and treat you better, then it goes away. And that's a rough reverse engineering of anger that indicates its function.
Mm-hmm. And what are the kinds of contexts and cues that trigger anger?
Well, that's a great question. So from my theory's perspective, the main anger in its extreme, or in its advanced form, and when you're really, really angry at someone, is about recalibrating their welfare trade-off ratio. And the welfare trade-off ratios, it's what we call an internal regulatory variable. It's not exactly a belief, it's not a desire. It's something sort of like how your body has an internal sense of its own temperature or its own water levels. It's like that. It's an estimate of how much you value another person relative to yourself. Mm-hmm. And so it'll feel like something like respect or love or deference, and there are subtle differences in how those are computed. But the end result is when I make a decision, if I have to make a decision and it's going to hurt you, the question is how much do I care about you compared to myself? Mm-hmm. And in theory, we have these towards everyone we know. That's why we treat some people better than we treat other people. And anger responds to that. It detects individuals who don't value you highly, gets into their brain and tries to recalibrate them upward. And so the question is, how do you know what someone's WTR is? In theory, it's a real thing in their brain. You could find it in the neurons, but we don't have the capacity to open up someone's skull and look for that. We don't see that well. We don't know what it looks like and so forth. So you look for the cues of what that welfare trade-off ratio is. And the template cue would be, well, what does the welfare trade-off ratio do? It indicates, or it determines when you're willing to impose a cost on someone else. If I value you very, very highly, then I won't impose a big cost on you, particularly for a small benefit, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of the earliest work I did on this theory was if you harm someone, you demonstrated a lower WTR, the more that person is hurt, and the less you've benefited from hurting them, right? Because if you haven't, so I don't know, you may or may not have seen, is it Trading Places with Eddie Murphy? You ever seen this?
No, I don't think so.
It's a great movie. Anyway, so some rich people ruin Eddie Murphy's or Dan Aykroyd's life over a bet. And at the end, he's like, well, a bet? Like, for how much? And he goes, $1. It's $1. And you realize, like, that's the most insulting it can be, right? If it had been millions of dollars, then you could understand why even a good friend might screw you over. Right. But to be screwed over for $1, like, right, that indicates the lowest ratio possible. Devastating consequences for you, tiny little benefit for me. I still think it's worth it. And what that indicates is that your welfare means nothing to me, right, or almost nothing to me. And so that large costs imposed for small benefits are prototypical, the most common cause of the trigger of anger. But welfare trade-off ratios are actually used for lots of things, and you can sort of reason about why that would be, given their function. So, for example, there are some people whose welfare is important for you and some people who are not. And the question is, where do you want to devote your limited memory space? You only can remember so much. You can only pay attention to so much. Who's worthy of your attention and memory? Well, people that I value highly, I need to pay very close attention to because I need to know what they need. I need to know what the consequences of my actions are for that person. So if I were considering moving, right, I would think about how that would impact my daughters, my wife, my friends. I'd consider my colleagues even to some extent. I like my colleagues. But I wouldn't give a damn about the impact of that move on the mailman or whoever has to rent the house after me or my neighbors who like me, that I don't talk too much. There are a whole host of people that I just never consult what the impact of my actions is for them because I don't care about them at all. You know, there's 7 billion people out there. Most of them I've never met and don't care about. And so what that indicates is that someone's memory of you is an indicator, is a predictor of the welfare trade-off ratio. If someone pays attention to you and remembers things about you, it means to some extent that they value your interests. That's why it's complimentary when people remember your name. It's why it's offensive when someone forgets an anniversary or forgets their wife's mother's name or whatever it is. And so that's another trigger of anger. One of the things that causes anger, when I look through databases of arguments that I've collected, one of the things that triggers anger is just lack of memory. Someone doesn't remember they were supposed to do something or they don't remember a person's name. And that triggers anger, right? Because it indicates this person's WTR is probably low. If it were high, they'd be paying attention to me and they'd be remembering these things. So there's lots of actually different cues of WTRs, and all of them in theory trigger anger. So I mentioned the cost impositions is the most common. The second most common are insults. This is based on databases of anger, of arguments I've gathered. And so if you think, again, about the function of welfare trade-off ratios, they delineate which people I need to value and which I don't. Well, why would you value anybody, right? Should evolution build us just to have as many of our own children as possible and destroy the world? Well, you have to value other people because if you don't value people who can hurt you, then they'll hurt you. So that's one. You have to value people who benefit you because if you don't, they might leave and then you won't get those benefits anymore. And none of this is consciously thought out, right? This is just the output of the system. It's just what we're built to do. We're built to value people and to fear people who can hurt us. We're built to value and to care about people who help us, built to care about kin and so forth. And so one of the ways to demonstrate a low welfare trade-off ratio is to show that you don't think someone is very good at a trait that is used to calibrate welfare trade-off ratios. So if we value people, for example, who are strong because they can hurt us, saying a man is weak is an insult, right? It's a statement that I don't need to value you. And if you think a man is weak, you will treat him worse, presumably. And if you think a man is strong, you'll treat him better. And so anger uses that, that if somebody indicates that you're weak, particularly as a man, because men are valued for their strength, they find that offensive. They find that anger provoking because here's this person who thinks I'm weak. I'll show him I'm not weak, and then he'll value me more. And you can see how that would be selected for. So same thing with being ugly or incompetent or stupid or a bad friend or any of the things you might insult somebody with. Insults are just a sort of litany and just a list of things, reasons to devalue a person. And when you perceive that someone else thinks that about you, it triggers anger. And it doesn't have to be an insult, like a direct insult, like your mom's fat or something. It can be completely unintentional too. So somebody tries to help you with a math problem that's very simple, and they're like, "Oh, Ricardo, hang on, I'll do that for you. Let me show you." And you're like, "I know how to do long division, you dick. What's the problem, right?" This guy thinks you're stupid, and so that's why he's helping you with this math problem, and that's offensive to you, even though he's trying to help. It's not about detecting people with bad intentions. It's about detecting people who have low welfare trade-off ratios.
So one of the last things you mentioned there Is there then a relationship between anger and cues of strength?
Oh yeah, so there's a big relationship there. So we mentioned the insults, but the other one is if you think about these kind of pillars that welfare trade-off ratios are built on, they largely relate to bargaining power, your ability to make another person value your interests, either by imposing costs on them or by denying them benefits. And so the traits needed in order to do that um, coalesce around formidability, hurting somebody, your ability to hurt them, and cooperative value, your ability to help them. And in theory, so insults on any of those traits, you'll notice will frequently cause anger. Most insults are about cooperative ability, right? If you call someone an asshole, you're not really calling them an anus. You're saying that you're a person who doesn't cooperate very well. That's roughly what it translates to. Same with bastard now. That used to be a comment on their coalitional strength. Okay, sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. So yeah, that's the source of the insults. Those same pillars, to the extent that you have them, they give you bargaining power. And if you have greater bargaining power, you can demand better treatment from others. And so, just like any other animal, right, the stronger, more dominant animals tend to get larger territory ranges. They tend to win conflicts of interest, right? Body size and winning conflicts of interest go hand in hand across just a huge range of species. A slide for this with just all the different species we found it in. And so that means that if you have these traits, you can afford to bargain for more, which means that evolution built us to the extent that we have bargaining power, we demand better treatment from others. And if we don't get that, we get angry. So you get great anger. If you have bargaining power, you get angry over a greater range of offenses, right? Being treated as average is offensive if you have above average bargaining power. In short, power corrupts, right? It makes you demand more of others. And so one of the earliest tests of our theory was that we looked at, particularly in men, that physical strength and fighting ability, the ability to actually harm another person physically, should correlate with both your sense of entitlement. You should demand, slightly better than average treatment, but also your anger and your history of aggression. And we showed those correlations, fairly powerful correlation, more powerful than the correlation between testosterone and aggression, for example. We showed that in the U.S. among the Chamane Indians in Ecuador. We did it among Romanians at one point. Archer and Thanzami showed it among in India. We had it among the Aka in the Central African Republic. Like a group of Swiss adolescents, we found this as well in Switzerland. And so, yeah, what it's showing is that as you get bargaining power, people demand more, and anger is about bargaining for better treatment, and so you just have this higher threshold, right? If you're well below average on every trait, you can't really bargain very much, and so you accept a kind of lesser treatment from others typically.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you distinguish between anger and other, I think we can say, closely related emotions like hatred?
Oh, that's a great question. So, this is something I've turned to recently. When I actually first got into studying anger, a friend of mine was the victim of a very violent crime. And I remember just being obsessed with getting revenge on this guy, which I never did. You get old, you give up on your dreams. But I realized much later that that really wasn't about anger. I wasn't trying to bargain with that person. I hated him and I wanted him gone. And that's when I realized I'm sort of missing something. That when I look at revenge, particularly the research on revenge, it seems clustered. There's revenge in a I'm going to hurt you and then you're going to know better kind of way. And then there's revenge in a I'm going to destroy you and delight in your suffering. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized these really aren't being caused by two different emotions, anger and hatred. And anger, they're similar in that they have very similar triggers, right? So if somebody just hurts you really badly, right, that shows a low welfare trade-off ratio, it triggers anger, but it also can cause hatred. By far, I'm not the first person to notice this distinction. Aristotle had talked about the difference between anger and hatred. And people have written about it before, and in general, the conclusion is anger is about either bargaining or sending a message, and hatred is about destroying. And so I started to take seriously what would the selection pressure for hatred be. The selection pressure for anger appears to be low welfare trade-off ratios. People are treating you badly over and over again, and you need to bargain for better treatment. But the selection pressure for hatred, I think, this is something we call the neutralization theory of hatred, is that there are some people whose existence is bad for you. That, and you can compute this kind of, you can see it very clearly if you just imagine a thought experiment where, we play out the world, you have your life, you have however many children you have. Then we rewind that with time travel. And we rewind that with time travel, and then we like take one person and then we just remove him, and then we do it again and see how many kids you have this time, right? So what's the present? The presence of a person has some impact on your fitness. It's either positive or negative, right? And if there are people out there whose existence is bad for you, well, that's a selection pressure. And the extent that you can destroy that person or neutralize that person, you'll reproduce better, right? So it's easy to think of examples, rivals, people who are hitting on your wife, people who are trying to hurt you or hurt your children, enemies of any kind, right? And so their existence becomes a negative selection pressure. The question is, what do you do about it? And when you consult the animal literature, what you see animals do in those cases is they often use kind of predatory aggression against them. So you can think of a small bird in the nest, pecking his brother's skull to death when he's born, because the existence of this brother costs him in fitness terms because of the limited food supply they have to share. And so I looked at predatory aggression in animals and noticed it's very different from the bargaining aggression you see, where like two cats puffing up and fighting each other is like two angry people. They're trying to show off how strong they are. In anger, you puff your chest up. You literally morph your face to highlight the high testosterone cues of strength in the face to show that you're angry. It's what the anger face is. But then there's predatory aggression. There's the cat killing the mouse. And the cat doesn't roar at the mouse. The cat doesn't bare its fangs. It's quiet. It pounces and so forth. And if you think about these as the sort of phylogenetically, the origins of anger and hatred, what hatred seems to be designed to do is to just heap costs on some human being in a way that's cost efficient. It's not designed to send a message. It's designed to impose many costs on this person. And the extent that it does that, that person either dies or leaves or disappears, or at the very least has less power to do the bad things that they're doing that are making your life worse. And you could sort of distinguish these two, anger and hatred. You can distinguish them by their behaviors or their triggers. So we have some new data in on anger and hatred behaviors. This work with Colton Scribner and Mitchell Landis and Anthony Lopez. And what the data show is that when you're angry, for example, you want to talk to the target. You want to explain why they're wrong. You want them to apologize. You actually seek them out, right? You want them to understand what they're doing wrong, and you want to know what they were thinking, right? One of the most common behavioral responses to anger is to ask questions of the person. Why did you do that? What the hell's wrong with you? Do you not know who I am? Did you not think I'd find out about this? That sort of thing. When you hate someone, you don't want to talk to them much at all, and you don't want them to talk to you. The last thing you do when you hate someone is to want to listen to their point of view. Hatred is extremely censorious. You can see this on Twitter, by the way. You can see it in our politics now, that anger is shifted to hatred and nobody wants to hear from anyone else anymore. And so the reason for that, presumably, is that with hatred, one of the things you want is for everyone else to hate this person too. And so hatred has a lot of behaviors, a lot of gossip-like behaviors, right? Where somebody does something wrong and then you tell everybody how terrible he is. And there's no particular reason to be honest about that either. If your goal, if the selection pressure is to remove this person, to weaken them to the point of death or desertion, it's informational warfare, right? There's no reason to be fair. There's no reason to be truthful about it. You just say whatever bad thing you can that other people will believe to get them to hate this person and to destroy them. The aggression from anger and hatred is very different in that in hatred, much like predatory aggression, it's sort of maximum lethality from the start. The goal is to impose costs on them. In anger, the goal of aggression is rarely to actually hurt the person. It's to prove that you could. It's why the early stages of an anger-based combat is like a push or a shove. Like no one's ever just been pushed and like a shoulder flies off. Like that never kills the target. What's the point of the push? It's the same thing with the cats hitting each other with their claws pulled in. It's a way of showing how strong you are. And the goal of the push is it's communicative. It's to show you that I can hurt you. And that's, it's why common anger-based fights don't involve, eye gouging or hitting on the genitals and things like that. There's an understanding, a kind of intuitive understanding, particularly among men, that if I escalate to that point, you'll escalate to that point too. And
Right.
what we're doing is a sort of game that involves one of us learning that we're weak and then we'll back down. Again, very similar to what animals do. It's classic work on the cichlid fish that shows the same escalated pattern of aggression. Um, it seems almost cooperative. It's two people trying to figure out who's tougher. But yeah, hatred doesn't seem to show that at all. The other big difference is anger is typically exterminated by apologies. If you're angry at someone, even seriously angry at them, and they give you a heartfelt apology that feels genuine, right? They don't even have to help you, but they just have to say, I was really wrong. You're a very good person. I underestimated you. I don't know why I thought that, but it was completely my fault. You absolutely didn't deserve that treatment. Everyone else, by the way, knows this. This is a fault with me and me not realizing what kind of a man you are. And I'm sorry about that, and it'll never happen again. That'll make more or less anything go away if it's anger. Apologies don't work on hatred at all. They're almost offensive, right? So you can think of I don't know, somebody being sentenced for, killing a bunch of people, and he says to the family, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and they're like, "Just fuck you," nobody wants to hear that, right? When you hate someone, like, what could Hitler say to the Jews that would make us think, "Oh, okay, well, that's all right then"? Like, there's just nothing. You hate him. An apology is meaningless at that point. Him recalibrating isn't the problem. The problem is he exists, and that problem of him existing isn't solved, right, by him changing his mind and upregulating a welfare trade-off ratio. So, yeah, those are some of the. You can also see the differences in the triggers. So, anger is triggered by low welfare trade-off ratios or indicators of disrespect, but hatred can be triggered. You can hate someone for all kinds of really bizarre reasons. So, for example, someone who really likes you, who respects you greatly and loves you. Imagine I don't know, a graduate student or something like that. But the graduate student just loves you so much that your wife starts getting jealous and angry and starts messing with your marriage, right? Now you can hate this graduate student even though she loves you more than anything. Like, what do you want her to do with her welfare trade-off ratio? It's sky high towards you. Like, anger won't do anything. I mean, you could try to communicate what she's doing so that she won't because she values you. But yeah, jealousy is another great example of this, right? Somebody gets the job that you want and they don't do anything bad to you. They just got a job, but you sort of hate them for taking it from you, right? Or your wife's ex-boyfriend, who she's still sort of attracted to, even though she picked you, and you can hate him even though he's never met you, right? He doesn't disrespect you. He doesn't know who you are, but you can hate him for it.
Right.
My favorite examples, you can actually, there's actually some decent evidence on this. It's really sad. It comes out of social psychology, where if you treat somebody badly, right, you turn them into an enemy because you've screwed them over. So they don't like you now. Well, now you have a person out there who doesn't like you. What's that person going to be doing? He's going to be hurting you. He's going to be imposing costs on you. Well, that makes him an enemy, right? Now you hate him for having hurt him. You hurt him and you hate him for it. Right, and that's just how it works. And it sounds perverse, but it's exactly how it works. Or someone could be a source of shameful information that you don't do anything wrong. Do you know? There's a story Christopher Hitchens used to say about a translator in the Iraqi army named Zahawi. Because his name started with the first name started with an M. I'm blanking on it. And he was translating for Saddam Hussein during a meeting with the UN. And the ambassador or the UN officials were being disrespectful to Saddam Hussein.
Okay.
And Hitchens was describing the story. He said at that point the translator would have known he was going to be killed because he witnessed the disrespect to Saddam. Saddam was embarrassed by that. And so when he leaves, he had him he was gay, so they hung him for being gay, the translator. Everybody had known that, but nobody was doing anything about it. But then he saw the leader humiliated, so he has to die, right? A source of bad information. Someone who knows shameful things about you can be an enemy. Anyway, sorry, I could talk about this stuff all day. Probably should stop.
No, let me ask you another related question related to hatred and anger. So, are these emotions also connected in any way to war?
Yes. So Anthony Lopez and I have been working on this. He's more of an expert in warfare than I am. So, Anthony Lopez is looking at warfare and its relationship between anger and hatred. We have a paper on it. The idea is that the hard part, the genuine hard part, is that group dynamics are extremely hard to model from a selection pressure point of view, because they have all these weird free rider problems where like our group can compete with another group, and if we win, we all have reproductive success. So there's a selection pressure to keep us together, but there's sort of the selection pressure to be the guy in the back of the line, who's not the one who dies in the war and then gets all the rewards, and then there are people who punish him, but then the people who punish become a free rider, right? Or the people who don't punish become a free rider because there's cost to punishment, and we have to model all that, and we're not great at it yet. So it's always a little bit more reserved. You have to be a little more kind of skeptical or a little cautious about modeling group dynamics like that. But what we know for sure is that group aggression seems to follow those same two patterns of bargaining aggression and neutralizing aggression. There are wars in which people bargain, in which we have a white flag, and the white flag signals that we give up and that we don't fight anymore. Right? That's very much like bargaining aggression in animals. It's like anger-based aggression. One side apologizes, and the other side's like, yeah, okay, fine, and then they take what they want, but the aggression at least typically stops. And then there's other kinds of aggression at the group level where one group just exterminates the other. This is it was like the no holds barred kind of warfare where nuke, kill the children, set the fields on fire, whatever you got to do to win the war. Sherman's March to the Sea, that sort of thing. And so we see these two kinds of warfares that seem related to both of these emotions. Now, in modern war, the people in charge may or may not be feeling any of these emotions because we're living in such an unnatural world where people make decisions about war but then don't fight them, which is not how our ancestors worked. Right? Our ancestors made decisions about war, and then they and their friends had to go do that. And that's not really how we work now. So modeling those, the politicians' behaviors, with these theories is going to be difficult, I think. But intuitively, group aggression follows these same patterns, which is this group has disrespected us, they treated us badly, they cut off Jenkins' ear, we're not going to tolerate that. So, England had the War of Jenkins' ear where they fought to get revenge about that. And it's sort of, again, established when they accept that we are stronger than them, then they send up the white flag, and then they will treat us better in the future because we have proved that we are stronger to them. So a lot of this logic falls right out of it. And you see these parallels that are just impossible to ignore between interpersonal aggression and warfare. And we even know that some of the same variables moderate individual differences here. So I was mentioning that stronger men are more prone to anger, but stronger men are also more prone to support military aggression, support warfare. So we had this data kind of from a number of countries now where physical strength, particularly in a man, tracks their support for like military spending, for example. We showed this in the US and Denmark, Argentina. We did not find it in Israel. That was one place we didn't find it. And one explanation for that is potentially that Israel's fighting much more defensive wars than these other countries are. And so it may be that even that weak and strong men may have similar thoughts about that because weaker men are particularly vulnerable during defensive war.
Right.
But that's highly speculative on my part. I think that's some of the connections that they're working on some of the same warfare is coming from the same mechanisms. It's just a little harder to model exactly how they work.
So another question that is sort of related to some of the topics we've been talking about here, like for example, when I earlier asked you about strength, cues of strength, and when we also talked a little bit about revenge, conflict, and all of that, what are the cues that males pay special attention to when they are assessing fighting ability?
What are the cues for you? So if you think about it, this is a very long-standing selection pressure, which is you need to know how tough your opponents are. And the earlier you know that, the better, right? You don't want to wait until he's got you in a headlock and realize he's stronger than you, or until he's broken your arm or something. And so much like other animals, we assess primarily with our senses before it actually comes to actual aggression. Most anger-based aggression starts with visual assessment or auditory assessment. So I've got a lot of data on this, but the short of it is you could assess upper body strength visually, largely from the size of the muscles and the upper body, right? So the chest strength and the arm strength seem to be two of the better cues that people's ratings of how strong a man looks track really well his bicep circumference. right? So when we look at people, we seem to be looking at the size of the arms as one of the main cues of how strong he is.
Right.
The more curious data came about from the from assessing from the face, that you can look at a man's face and assess how strong he is, and that's without the neck, just the face.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the correlations typically are about 0.45 between how strong a man looks, and how strong his face looks, and how much he can actually lift at a gym.
Mm-hmm.
So those are reasonably sized correlations, right? That you can size up a man from cues in the strength in the face. And I was interested in that because of the anger face, right? Which is, I mentioned this briefly before, but I can go into some detail. So people get angry, they make a face, particularly when they're violently angry. It involves like pulling the eyebrows down,
Mm-hmm.
flaring the nostrils a bit, lips go up in the mouth, cheekbones go up. And that's universal. It's recognized across cultures. Blind children make the same face, so it's not something you have to teach them. 6-month-old babies will make it. They don't make it quite right, but they're close.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, chimps don't have it, so it's not something that we got from phylogenetically from chimpanzees. They do not bring their eyebrows down and together when they get aggressive. And so something happened in the last 5 million years that made that people who made this face had more children than people who didn't. And that's weird, right? Why is it that I do this when I'm angry and that results in me having more kids? And the answer appears to be, this is something Darwin noticed a long time ago with other animals, is that they have formidability enhancement displays. They're ways of posturing to make yourself look as tough as possible before a conflict so that the other person backs down, and then you can win without having to pay the costs of aggression. And so if the anger face is that, then each of these anger faces, or each of these action units, each of these muscle movements when you're angry, ought to make you look stronger. We do this with our eyebrows because people with eyebrows that look like this are stronger than people whose eyebrows look like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I did. I had this study on this published in 2014, where I have these artificial faces, and I just take one piece of the anger face at a time. Like anger moves the mouth up on the face like this, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that upward motion gives the illusion that your jaw is bigger than it actually is, or your chin is bigger than it actually is. So you take a normal computer face, you move the lips up, and you see if that makes him look stronger or not, and it does. And it just does for everything that the anger face does. Bringing the eyebrows down makes you look stronger, widening the nose makes you look stronger, moving the cheekbones up makes you look stronger, thinning your lips makes you look stronger, moving the mouth up makes you look stronger. It's just each one of them, right? And so that's really good evidence that what the anger face actually is this sort of a constellation of muscle movements that collectively send this signal of maximum strength. Now, there's a burning question here that a lot of people miss that's been haunting me, which is why the hell are there cues of strength in the face, right? So you don't lift weights with your face if you're doing it right, right? So why does somebody who can lift weights really, really well have a different bone here, or like a larger bone here that's lower on their skull? Like, and David Carrier and I we actually have never talked about this, but he and I published very similar things. One of these years we've really got to talk. But he's made an argument that a lot of the facial changes from humans, since we split with our chimpanzee human ancestor, had to do with the fact that we stood up and started punching each other in the face. And so we started evolving these thicker bones in the face to withstand blunt force trauma, whereas chimpanzees more typically rend or bite during combat. Humans punch a lot, and we hammer punch to the face. And so one explanation for why some people have a stronger face than others is that when your body's built for combat and you get larger and stronger, it may also change the bone structures of your face to make it better at resisting blunt force trauma. And so that would explain why they have thicker bones here, which you give the illusion of when you push your eyebrows down. You have thicker bones here, which you give the illusion of when you like flare your nostrils upward. Have thicker bones here, which you get the illusion of by moving your mouth up on the face. So that's one explanation. The other possibility is that it has to do with bite strength, that men actually do fight. They don't lift with their face, but they do fight with their face. They can bite, and biting is extremely dangerous. We don't do it nearly as much as chimps do, but it's one of the few things you can't do in MMA, right? You can elbow a guy in the face, but you can't bite him, right? Because biting is considered too dangerous. So it is a real fighting tactic. It's something children do spontaneously. They don't have to learn that. My little girl figured out how to bite all by herself. It's something, when people get into states of rage, they often feel themselves clenching their teeth and biting.
Hmm.
So I think we may have underestimated the extent to which biting was important for humans because it's so much less important for us than chimps and most other mammals. Um, but yeah, another possibility is that the features of the strength in the face relate to your ability to bite, at least some of them. So, for example, the muscles that attach to your chin to give you your bite strength have to go underneath this muscle right here.
Hmm.
Or sorry, underneath this bone right here. And so the larger
Okay.
your cheekbones are, the larger that muscle can be, for example. And they also attach here on the squares of the jaw. This beard's really getting in the way of my research. Um, but yeah, they attach down here, which is one of the most sexually dimorphic parts of the skull. If you sex type a skull, one of the first things you do is you look for this bone here to see how much it comes down, like Batman's jaw, like a really square jaw, and that's a
Right.
man, or if it's very narrow, then it's a woman. And that's where the bite muscles attach to that enable you to bite hard. And men have much greater bite strength than women. It's like 1.5 times or something like that. So it's that suggests this is weird considering we have the same diet. So why did
Right.
men bite more? It's presumably because we were using it for aggression. Um, anyway, we could go on about that. So yeah, there are cues of strength in the face, and yes, humans spontaneously assess them and can tell who's strong and who isn't based on their face. They might relate to blunt force trauma. They might relate to bite strength. We're not sure yet. There are cues in the voice as well that you can hear how strong a man is with some accuracy. And so, and in my research, you could hear this across cultures. I could play you voices from men in the Tsimane, this strange nasally language that you've never heard before, but you could tell who was strong and who was weak among them, and it would predict how much they could actually lift. Um, so yeah, that's another one that anger seems to change. When people get angry, their voice changes, particularly when you become violently angry. When you become violently angry, your voice seems to almost drop in pitch and increase in volume. Um, we haven't had much success figuring out exactly what the voice is doing in those cases, but we know that when people get violently angry, think of do you see the 300, the Spartan movie?
Yeah, yeah.
He had that famous line where he yelled, "This is Sparta," and kicks the guy into the well. Like he
Hmm.
yells really loudly with a very deep voice, which is hard to do, and it gives the impression of great physical strength. And
Right.
so that's another thing. The cues of anger or the cues of strength are interesting to me most because of formidability assessment mechanisms, and they're worth studying, but mostly because in anger, these things are exaggerated as a way of bargaining for better treatment. And so you anger a man and he lowers the pitch of his voice and starts talking to you like this. And then he puffs his chest up really big and wide and he morphs his face so he looks like he's physically stronger and so forth.
Hmm. So, just to wrap up this part about emotions, of course, we focus just on two of them, but are emotions adaptations?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think I'm not sure. I don't never seen anyone identify an emotion and argue that it wasn't. Okay, hang on. There are people outside of evolutionary psychology who've done that. People who typically use evolution to explain the human mind identify emotions as adaptations. The key to it, the key to identifying an adaptation is showing complex functional design, something that is well geared towards solving an adaptive problem. And almost all the emotions we identify have that pretty clearly. Like fear is a really obvious example, right? That you identify a threat, you then change your perceptual systems and your attentional systems and increase your blood flow, and then you either run away or hide or so forth, right? It makes perfect sense. The only exception I can think of, I guess, would be humor. We haven't had great explanations for the evolution of humor. There have been some new ones that I haven't read yet, so I shouldn't imply that those people don't know what they're doing. But but many great careers have floundered when they try to explain why humor would have evolved. Why is it funny that Jim Carrey can make a face that looks weird? You know what I mean? Somebody's walking and they trip and fall, and
Yeah.
that's funny until they break something, and then it's not funny anymore.
Hmm.
Um, it is just not clear why that evolved. So yeah, I guess I can't swear that every emotion is an adaptation, but most of them have very obvious evolved features, and that when you really apply the selection pressure and reverse engineer that emotion, you can start discovering all kinds of complex features that are really good at solving that selection pressure. I guess humor just seems to be the exception to me, but again, I haven't read the latest research on it.
So, one last topic then. I would like to ask you about criminal justice. I mean, first of all, what are justice making institutions? And since we're talking about emotions and emotions from an evolutionary perspective, are
Mhm.
they connected in any way to this sort of institution?
That's a great question. So yeah, I think justice-making institutions are just the institutions that sort of third parties put together to govern the resolution of conflict. So if you can think of, why do we care about third parties, right? Why would we evolve to care about third parties? How does that impact
Mhm.
my reproduction?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is, in short, is that we evolved to live in small hunter-gatherer bands. And in these bands, you had people who were not necessarily related to you, though they may have been, but that your survival depended on them doing well. You'd have cases where other people would hunt, for example, to provide food. You'd have people, they'd repel enemies. Humans probably came from a very long history of warfare. Richard Wrangham has some data on this. Um, uh, Lawrence Keeley also estimated that about a third of males died in homicidal or war, either in homicide or war during evolutionary last millions of years. Um, and so it's very likely that we came from a long history of warfare, which the survival of my friends depended on, or my survival depended on the survival of my friends and my colleagues. And so that becomes a problem because what if, Tony and Bob can't get along anymore? And then
Mhm.
Tony and Bob eventually break each other apart, and then they're best friends, and they splinter, and now your group splintered, and you both get conquered, right? And so at some point, the the conflicts of our neighbors become problems for us. And if we assume that's true, and it seems like it is, both in modern day and would have been even more so ancestrally, um, then you should imagine that we should evolve to try to resolve conflicts between them. So that if Tony and Bob are getting into a fight, the rest of us who outnumber Tony and Bob by a lot, right, we have much more bargaining power than either one of those individually, typically, then we should evolve to resolve that conflict in some way that makes it, quote, fair. And by fair, what I mean is that both Tony and Bob can live with it and don't need
Mhm.
to keep bargaining. It's one explanation for what fairness actually is. It's that which the principal people involved will tolerate and the mob will favor. Um, and so, yeah, in that case, um, the criminal justice system itself sort of looks like that. In fact, I did this paper recently where the criminal justice system seems like third-party anger just instantiated with rules. So simple things like you want to detect people in your group that don't value your group sufficiently and are willing to impose costs on people, and then you want to recalibrate them so that they do, so that they treat them better. And so criminal offenses are just indicators of really low WTRs, right? That you murder somebody for some pathetic reason, and that makes you a really, a bad contributor, and so you want to be punished for that. If you murder somebody for a good reason, like they're trying to kill you, that's not a crime. Or if you murder someone because the only way for you to live was to kill them, that's not a crime either. There's excusable and justifiable homicides that cover those cases. And so, yeah, if you go through the criminal justice system, it has a lot of these features that look like third parties trying to recalibrate people with low WTRs. And you can see it in some of these kind of random things, like before you're tried, the charges against you have to be made very clear. When you're sentenced, they remind you of why you're being sentenced, which is a very strange thing when you think about it. If the point of punishment is just to punish them, why do you have to remind them what they've done? What's the point of that, right? That's recalibrational. That's saying, look, you did bad thing X, and
Mhm.
therefore we are going to do this other thing, so that those two are right next to each other in your mind. That because you stole this money, you are now going to go to jail for 6 months. And so it's a reminder enabling you to recalibrate, right?
Mhm.
So it seems designed to do that in that respect. Um, so anyway, yeah, I think the justice-making institutions are largely about um, the anger of the third parties who are outraged that some person did this, Bob hurt Tony, and then trying to find a fair resolution to it to recoup the group cooperation needed to survive in ancestral environments.
But is criminal justice based primarily on punishment or repair?
Oh, by repair, you mean rehabilitation, I assume? Is the term.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, well, in practice, I think as a criminologist, I'd have to say punishment is by far the way it's interpreted. Um, I mean, in criminology, there's generally four justifications given for why you can imprison somebody, right? Or you can violate their liberty and put them in a cage. The first is retribution, which is a moral argument that says they deserve to be punished. Somebody rapes a 16-year-old girl and strangles her. Well, I want that man to die. I want him to suffer. That's the right thing to do. That's retribution. There's also deterrence, which is you just send a signal to everybody so that this, is not accepted. There's rehabilitation, where you, in theory, punish someone to make them better. And there's incapacitation, which is, I don't necessarily hate this person, but he's hurting people because of this mental disorder, so we have to put him in prison to keep the rest of us safe. And those are sort of the justifications that criminologists give for imposing people. And only one of them is really about repair, and that's rehabilitation. And for juvenile justice, for juvenile offenders, the court really is built around doing that. It's just, honestly, the hard part is we don't know how to do it. Talk to anybody in these areas. There are interventions we know sometimes can work. There's some job training programs that we know can help. Getting people therapy has been shown to have some impact on lowering recidivism rates, for example. But by and large, we're just not good at, especially in a cost-effective manner, taking a person who's committed a large number of violent crimes, isolating them from society for 15 years, and then releasing them a much better person. We're just not good at doing that. We don't know quite how to. And the things we're doing tend to often make things worse, which is we put them in a cage with a bunch of other people who have committed different crimes, and they all learn from each other, and resentment grows, and they feel like they're being punished far beyond what they actually deserve, because that's what people typically feel when they're punished. And so they're left, resentful, sometimes physically stronger, which is also a problem, and with, even fewer job opportunities than they had before. So there is a real problem, I think, with criminal justice. It's not clear that, emptying the prisons is the right move. Like anything else, it ends up being complicated, and it's sadly become political, making it very difficult to have intelligent conversations about it anymore. But no, I think the criminal justice system, as currently instantiated, is very much about punishment. And you can see that in the public attitude, too. It's, some of the worst features of the criminal justice system are the widespread rape of men in prisons. And that's still sort of a joke on TV. Like, it's still, oh, you're a real pretty man. They're going to enjoy you in prison. And then we're supposed to laugh at this guy getting raped over and over again, possibly getting AIDS and dying. And when you study rape in prison, like, it ceases to be funny. I don't know. I don't like to remove people's humor from them. Humor in the world, good, enjoy that. But the more you know about it, the more awful it seems. It just makes it a little bit harder to laugh, I think. So no, our justice system, I think, is very heavily focused on punishment. I think to a large extent it has to be, until we actually know how to make interventions and take somebody who's done something horrible and turn them into a better person.
Right. So, Dr. Sell, just before we go, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I got a Google Scholar account. If you want to read any of my papers, just go in there and type in Aaron Sell. They appear as rapidly as they can. I'm on Twitter. I don't post a hell of a lot, but occasionally I'll make some comments there. And my colleagues like to post things that we publish together, so I'll reshare those. You can find them. Or yeah, just email me if you're curious. I'm at acell@heidelberg.edu.
Okay, great. I will be leaving some links to that in the description box of this interview. And Dr. Sell, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, happy to do it. Thank you, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Einlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at einlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Calenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila de Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luís Caetano, Tom Wagner, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.